Hello, folks. This is Andrew Gilmore with another episode of Mostly Movies, Maybe Music. And this will be an interesting show today because my guest is Noah Diamond, who a lot of you out there probably know. But for those of you who don't, he is an actor, comedian, writer, singer, graphic designer, cartoonist. He does just about everything, I think. And he's also the co host of, I think, one of the best podcasts out there, the Marx Brothers Council podcast. And that's how we connected, really, because of our mutual love for the Marx Brothers and classic comedy in general. And if you don't know, the Marx Brothers Council is a very active Facebook group, and that's how we met, basically. And we've known each other online for 10 years. And as Noah was pointing out to me a minute ago, we've never actually met and spoken to each other this way. And most of our Facebook interaction has mostly just been throwing jokes at each other. We've never really had a substantial conversation that I can recall, other than just making wisecracks. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's just kind of how we function. But I thought it would be a good idea to have him on here and get to know each other a little more. And he was very nice about accepting my invitation. So here he is. So, Noah, it's certainly a pleasure to have you on this show.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me on. And yes, as you acknowledge, it's a pleasure to actually speak with you.
Yes, well, it might not be a pleasure half an hour from now. I don't know.
I'll keep you posted.
Hmm. Well, so I guess I'll just start at the beginning because I know from reading your posts online and all of that that you, I guess, we're similar in a sense that you have this deep knowledge of comedic history and history of vaudeville, history of theater, and all of that. So, how did that all start for you? Where does that come from?
Oh boy, I didn't know you were going to start with the hardest question in the world. I don't know where it comes from, why we're drawn to specific kinds of things. I think as far as like where I specifically encountered the kind of stuff that I would eventually spend so much of my time on, I think The Muppet Show was an important
Mm-hmm.
early influence. I was born in the late 70s, so my childhood was
The
lined up with the
1870s?
yeah, the 1870s. Yes, just around the time Don Amici invented the telephone.
Yes, exactly.
I think the Muppet Show is the first place where I encountered like a sense of old time song and dance showbiz, you
Sure.
know? That was probably an important beginning. But on the other hand, my entire generation grew up watching the Muppet Show. Not everyone developed an obsession with the Marx Brothers.
Yeah. And I guess you're reminding me, I have the same birthday as Jim Henson, so I've always had an affinity
Oh,
for his stuff too.
yeah, I mean, Jim Henson and what he created, it's one of those, it's impossible to overstate the size of that achievement. He's one of, a handful of artists you can talk about that way. And I think particularly because the Muppets and the world of the Muppets is especially appealing to children. And at the age I was, the cultural moment where the Muppets were at that time, it was just kind of right there, and it was overwhelming. If I had discovered old Hollywood musicals first, I might have gotten there that way, but I
Right.
didn't.
Yeah. So then what was the progression from watching the Muppets as a child to then learning more about showbiz history and digging deeper into that?
Well, an important step was my discovery of this book by Joe Adamson. And I'll do the abridged version because I've told this story so many times. But, when I was a little kid, I was really obsessed with books. Even before I could truly read, I just loved looking at books. And my parents had the living room walls in the house where I lived as a little boy were lined with bookshelves. And I really loved pulling all the big books off of their shelves, big art books and history books and stuff that was just interesting to a little kid that suggested that the world was a much larger place than I
Mm.
understood.
Yeah.
And so one of the books on their shelf that I just happened to take out and look at one day was the immortal Joe Adamson book about the Marx Brothers,
Yep.
Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo. I'm sure, Andrew, you've read this book many
Yes.
times. And, as I say, I was not yet able to grapple with the writing in this book, but just the pictures. Oh my God, who are these guys? The Marx Brothers. They looked a little bit familiar to a kid who was accustomed to staring at the Muppets and Dr. Seuss and Maurice Sendak. I thought, oh, Alice in Wonderland. There's some continuity with these Marx Brothers and the world of children's entertainment that I know. And it just was one of the favorites. I would go and take that book off the shelf and just look at the faces in it. And so I kind of learned all about the Marx Brothers before ever seeing one of their films. And that certainly was another kind of portal to a world where I knew I wanted to spend more time.
Right. So, of course, I'm happy to talk about the Marx Brothers, but just trying to get the bigger picture here. Obviously, they were pivotal to you, but then how did you go from that to learning about other comedians of that era?
It comes from, as soon as you're kind of swimming around in that soup, you start to realize there's all these other fish in there with you, if you'll pardon the horrible metaphor. Soup filled with fish.
What?
Never mind
Just other
that.
swordfish.
Yeah, swimming with those swordfish. Yeah, I think some of it came from the adults in my life. Oh, you like the Marx Brothers so much. I wonder if you might like Jack Benny. Why don't you listen to
Right.
this? That kind of thing, references. Or from reading and learning about the Marx Brothers, you learn that they are adjacent to all these other figures. I mean, W.C. Fields is an example of that. I probably didn't know anything about Fields except that his name came up a lot in the Joe Adamson book about the Marx Brothers.
Sure.
So, oh, let's find out who that guy is.
Right.
It's that kind of thing. And as I got a little older, I added more heroes to the list. And those heroes also had little sidebars of references to investigate or, oh, if you like this, you might like that.
Right. Well, of course, I mentioned on Facebook that I was going to ask you about some of your other favorite comedians besides the Marx Brothers, and you kind of led me into that. But do you want to elaborate there?
Sure, yeah, other comic heroes. Well, Danny Kaye is a big one for me. I
Sure.
always like to bring him up because I don't think he appears on too many people's lists of favorite comedians. But I am a champion for him and love his work and loved it very early on. He's challenging in some ways because um, most of his movies are not that great.
Hmm.
There's only a couple of movies that really show him off, or there's only a couple of movies that are equal to his talent.
Yeah, I agree.
But as even in his lesser films, I learned a lot from him and loved him a lot. Um, in a later generation, Woody Allen and Mel Brooks are
Sure.
both hugely important to me. Um, Mel Brooks, particularly in everything besides his films, although I like his films a lot too. The 2000-Year-Old Man records
Yeah.
are, something like being a sort of Talmud of comedy. I mean, every syllable of those records, every inflection is burned into my brain, and it's the kind of thing, as with Groucho, you quote it without even realizing it. It's
Yeah.
just in your, in your bones. Yeah, so those are some, and then of course there are many many others. I guess those are the big ones. I guess that's kind of my Mount Rushmore of comedy.
Right. Well, I was going to mention, I know we both have a fondness for Tom Lehrer as well.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Tom Lehrer is a huge hero of mine. And I also love, as much as comedy, I really love songwriting
Sure.
and um, Broadway musicals, The Great American Songbook. Tom Lehrer has a foot in the world of, he is a classic comedian. He's also just such a spectacularly great craftsman of song.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I probably had those albums memorized in high school, so I can remember listening to
Yeah.
them all the time.
Oh,
Yeah.
just so good. And even with Tom Lehrer too, even the spoken introductions to the songs
Yes.
are so good. I mean, yeah, I was just the other day thinking about the story about Henry,
Yes.
Hen3ry, you know, or Dr. Samuel Gall, the inventor of the gallbladder,
Right.
or gargling practiced furtively by a remote tribe in the Andes who passed the secret down from father to son as part of their oral tradition. That's the kind of stuff that when I was a kid just, grabbed me and said, like, do that, whatever hill that's on, add to that hill.
Yeah. Well, I tried, but I never made it. Yeah.
Well,
I used to try to write funny songs in junior high school, but I could never be him, of course.
nobody could. I mean, if
Yep.
you hold yourself to that standard,
Yeah.
Um, but songwriting is has a lot in common with joke writing.
Yes.
It has a lot to do with concision. The number of syllables is very important. The rhythm is very important. In the same way that, if you're crafting the punchline of a joke, you want to put the important word last if possible. You
Right.
want to land on the word that gets the laugh. It's exactly the same thing in a song. You want the rhyming ends of lines to be the most important words in what you're saying. Um,
Well,
yeah,
of
there's
course,
a lot of similarities.
well, I was going to say you have proof that I'm aware of that because of that thing I sent you, but there you go.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you wrote. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, we should tell the audience that we were going to end this show with a song parody that I wrote, but I can't really sing, and Noah didn't think that Noah didn't think the technology of it would work, so between us we canceled it. But I did send Noah the lyrics that I wrote, and I guess he liked them. So
Yeah,
that's
they're good.
yeah. Well, thank you. That's high praise. So yeah, I do see the similarity between joke structure and songwriting, so I get it. Oh, I think your screen froze there.
Oh, am I?
Oh, there you are.
Have I lost contact? Oh, okay, good.
There you are. Just lost you for a second there, I think. But anyway, I guess since we're kind of following your journey into discovering comedy, we should get back to the Marx Brothers. And how did you see the films after reading Adamson's book?
Well, it's funny. I always sort of had my eyes out for them because I had the idea in my head that I really liked the Marx Brothers because of this book. But, I'm sort of just old enough to have been a child at a time when it wasn't that easy to find old movies. I mean, it was the three television networks and PBS, that was all. I just never happened to encounter a Marx Brothers movie on television at any point in my childhood. Movies were kind of rare commodities. I mean, I was just remembering with somebody the other day about how every year at Thanksgiving they would show The Wizard of Oz on
Right.
television. You know, I mean, on a screen, a square screen with round corners, interrupted by commercials. And we looked forward to that for weeks, the opportunity to see The Wizard of Oz. So the thought of like, gee, I sure would like to see horse feathers, but how in the world would somebody go about doing that? Then, as my childhood ground on, home video kind of entered the picture. I think we first had a VCR like in the house when I was 12. And so that's when I first saw the Marx Brothers movies. It was my stepfather who first said, "All right, this is ridiculous. We've got to put this kid in front of the Marx Brothers." We were at dinner one night. Groucho's name had come up, I think probably in a context like that I said something Groucho like. And so the next night I was sitting in front of the TV watching Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera. So I was 12 by the time I actually got to see them.
Yeah, that's interesting because we are, I'm a little younger than you, and so, I was very much a VHS kid, so I didn't have to go through that. The Marx Brothers were just there, and my dad brought home a copy of Horse Feathers, and I watched it, so I was lucky that way.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It is undoubtedly lucky. And whenever I'm talking to young people about the Marx Brothers, I always feel like that's one of the great things about living in this age. Oh, you think you might be interested in the Marx Brothers? Take your phone out of your pocket. You can be watching their best work in half a second. And that's lucky. On the other hand, I'm not sure I would trade places. There was also
Right.
something wonderful and lucky about having to search for things.
Yes. Well, even in our local video store, they didn't always have everything, and I would have to try to find things in other ways, so I'm just old enough to have that experience before the internet came along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that too. Like, even though you could go to the uh, video store and find some Marx Brothers movies, you probably couldn't find all of them. And this is true across the board. And so there would always be like a wish list. In my case, actually, it was the one you started with, Horse Feathers, for some
Yes.
reason was hard to find in my world, which I guess just means, they didn't have it at any store near me or at the library. So by the time I finally saw Horse Feathers, I was able to appreciate like, oh, this is one of the best ones, and it's still waiting for me.
Yeah. So then, what was your reaction when you finally saw them? Were you just hooked right away, like I was?
Yeah, yeah, it was instant. I mean, I already knew that I was going to love them. I'd sort of had been set up to love them more than anything else. I guess the biggest difference was that after seeing the movies, I started modeling myself after Groucho.
Right.
At first to an absurd degree that I've since managed to control. But I mean, until I saw the films, I don't know that I really saw myself as Groucho.
Or did he see himself as you?
I doubt it very much.
Hmm. Well, then you're at a disadvantage there, I think.
Well, there was a certain, as you note, I also am a performer, and more so when I was a child and a teenager, there's the two things come together. You fall in love with some cultural thing, and then you also kind of want to be that thing,
Right.
you know? Like you loved Star Wars, and watching Star Wars was great fun, but you also kind of wanted to dress up like those characters and run around and have a
Right.
lightsaber. And well, I realized pretty early on that there was no practical way to be Luke Skywalker. Um, and the Muppets, I had puppets, and that's how I would be them.
Yeah.
Um, but the Marx Brothers, well, you could actually be like that if you wanted to.
In a way. Yeah. And well, I guess I'm trying to think of what my next question is. Um, sorry, I'm so interested in listening to you that I kind of lost my train of thought.
No,
But
no problem at all.
well, I guess I know one of your early experiences with the Marx Brothers was that you did a production of Animal Crackers when you were 14. So I'd be interested to hear about that.
That is true. Yeah. Well, um, by that time, I kind of realized that all the things I was interested in could come under this one umbrella, which was theater. And my interests kind of solidified at that point. Like, oh, that's actually what I want to do is be in the theater. And I realized, like, although I love movies and I love the movies starring these heroes of mine, that for whatever reason, um, putting on plays kind of captured my imagination in a way that
Yeah.
making movies didn't. I think partly that was because putting on plays was possible. When I was a kid, like the thought of making a movie was just, I wouldn't know how to start. But I knew how to get some friends together and say, all right, you be the king and you be the princess, and we're going to
Right.
put on a play. So anyway, at that point, early teenage years, I was getting involved with, community theater in the area where I lived. I was, making friends that way by acting in plays and doing theater. And so one of the things I did was this review that I put together of all my favorite classic comedians. Um, Sort of my favorite material from, Burns and Allen and Laurel and Hardy and the entire second act of this production was a condensed version of Animal Crackers. And so that was the first time I, played the role of Groucho in front of an audience.
And how did that go over?
It went over well, I mean, it was a very heady experience. For me, that was kind of the first. I mean, it wasn't exactly a piece of writing because all the material was
Right.
taken from comedians I loved, but I assembled it, I strung it together and wrote some continuity to tie it all together. And I directed this show and cast, people in it, held auditions. It was the first time I really went through that whole process of producing a play. I also, of course, cast myself in a few favorite roles,
Right.
including Groucho. And so, yeah, it was a big deal at the time for me, and it was, the first time doing something that I would go on to do a lot of. We
Yeah.
did it for 3 weeks. At this point, I lived in South Florida. I was born in Connecticut. I lived in around various towns in Connecticut till I was 12. Then I lived in South Florida from the ages of 12 to 20. So the high school years are in there. And we did this show for 3 performances over the course of a weekend at a community theater in South Florida.
Well, if you were in Florida, I'm surprised you didn't do the coconuts.
Yeah, I have never done the coconuts, but
Mm.
yes, it's true. I do know some of that lore. I mean, um, the Florida land boom continues to cast a shadow over South Florida if you know where to look for it.
Mhm. So, I wanted to ask you. Oh, I'm thinking of a couple of different questions here, but one thing I wanted to mention was that we've both played Groucho. I don't know if you knew that about me.
I don't think I did.
Yeah, I did just in an amateur way, not like you've done, but I was a theater student in college, and I did a scene from Animal Crackers in one of my classes, and then I've done a lot of radio, and I've done a couple of the Flywheel scripts. So it
Oh,
was,
that's
yeah,
terrific.
and
There's nothing like it, right? I mean,
yeah,
just putting that character on is a great experience.
yeah. I mean, mostly I want to focus on you, but I can tell you some stories about myself if you want to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just as far as doing Animal Crackers. They had a theater workshop every year. I didn't do any actual plays when I was there, but they had the theater workshop where people could just get up and sing a song or do whatever they wanted to do. So I got a couple of actors together and we did the left-handed moth scene. And I don't know if he's watching this, but the guy who played Chico was a guy named Mark Lombardo, who was a very funny guy. And shout out to Mark if you're watching this because he was great. But
Hey, Mark.
yeah, he's he's a New York guy. He's from Brooklyn. I think he's still there. And anyway, I remember that I wanted to do Animal Crackers one year, but I couldn't get any actors, so that was really disappointing. And then the following year, the theater department just called me out of the blue and said, "Oh, we have this proposal from you to do Animal Crackers from a year ago, and do you want to do that? And we'll provide the actors for you." So I said yes, of course, and that was, but it was only 2 days before the show went on, so we had 48 hours to rehearse.
Oh my
So
goodness.
we just got it together very quickly. But thank God that they got some people for me, and we were able to do it. And the interesting thing about it, I think, is that it was mostly an audience of college kids who I think had probably never even heard of the Marx Brothers, but and didn't know what we were doing, but it got a lot of laughs. They liked it, so I think the jokes translated even without that context. So it was fun.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find mostly the material is so excellent and the Marx Brothers style of presentation is so distinctive if you get anywhere near it that the material really, if people are willing to give it a chance, they tend to enjoy it. They tend to see what's good about it.
Yeah. And I have the video on my YouTube channel. I can send it to you. So
Oh yeah, I'd love
yeah.
to see that.
Yeah. I'm not. I don't have a lot of stage experience, so you'll see I'm kind of stiff, but my delivery was okay, I guess.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Sure. I'll send it to you.
I mean, it's a whole other subject or a sub-subject, but I love seeing people play the Marx Brothers, it doesn't even have to be done, impeccably well to kind of tickle me. I think it's great. And I do sometimes hear fans say the exact opposite. I can't bear to watch people impersonate the Marx Brothers. And I understand why they feel that way, but I'm the opposite. I think you have to accept that nobody will ever, you know, replicate their work exactly. You're always going to fall short. The most gifted Marx Brothers impressionists in the world are at best reminiscent of greatness. But
Yeah.
I still love to see it. I just love the fact that people want to do that, want to dress up as those guys and talk and behave like them, and that material still has a life in front of audiences. I think that's really important. You know,
Yes.
the Marx Brothers were mostly stage performers.
Right.
Thank goodness they made those films, and we have this record of their work. But I think of their films almost, like documentaries. I mean, not that they are documentaries, but that their value is a documentary value. It's preserved the work of these performers and the material that was written for them. Seeing the Marx Brothers deliver it on film, that's one very authentic version of it. But to appreciate the full authenticity of that material, you kind of also have to see how it interacts with a live audience, delivered by
Yes.
live actors. It's part of the story.
Yeah. And you sparked a thought that, speaking of people playing the Marx Brothers, I've seen Frank Ferrante twice, and I was just thinking that, talking about the recognition factor, I don't know whether maybe 10 years from now people are going to know who Groucho Marx was anymore. So I would hate to think that Frank won't be able to make a living doing that 10, 15 years from now, but hopefully he will. But what are your thoughts there?
I tend to be optimistic on that stuff. I think there will be an audience for the Marx Brothers in 10 years, in 20 years, in 100 years. It is admittedly a niche audience. I mean, I can't argue that the Marx Brothers are, at the heart of popular culture right now.
Right.
But, they actually do have a lot of attention on them. It's interesting. Just last week, I live in New York. Just last week, I attended an event on Zeppo's birthday.
Right.
This was also a book event for Robert Bader's recent biography of Zeppo Marx. I saw lots of Marx Brothers people there. It was a very Marxian occasion. A lot of excitement, felt like a big deal, big New York event, around the Marx Brothers. And then less than a week later, I attended a screening of Monkey Business at the Film Forum in downtown Manhattan, introduced by Adam Gopnik, a great New Yorker staff writer and a friend of mine and a friend of the Marx Brothers. I mean, it's like two big calendar events within less than a week of each other. And these were Marx Brothers events that I wasn't responsible for. You know, People know who they are. I think the Marx Brothers are kind of safe. I do think there are certainly classic showbiz personalities that are in danger of being, I don't know about totally forgotten, but let's say little remembered. But the Marx Brothers, I don't know. I think they have a little bit of that magic in the same way that, Marilyn Monroe is still universally recognized.
Who?
Yeah, the Marx Brothers aren't quite that level of icon. But I feel that there is and will always be an audience for them. And I think um, uh, part of the reason I feel hopeful about that is because I've so often had the experience of seeing young people enjoy the Marx Brothers. And a big part of the sort of mission of a lot of the Marx Brothers work that I've done has been to involve young people. And, they like them when they watch them. Um, I also have, in general, like a strong aversion to. I just never want to catch myself being an old guy saying young people don't know anything, and
Yeah.
back in my day everything was better. Every generation does that, and they're all wrong, and they all sound silly. Especially because we're talking about stuff that's like a few generations earlier than us. It's
Right.
not like we grew up with the Marx Brothers because they were at the heart of popular culture. We found them, and largely it's because people thought to expose us to them. So we just have to keep passing that along.
Right. Well, you're talking to a guy with a big wall of 78s behind him, so I guess that shows you
Yeah,
where I stand.
I see exactly where you
Yeah.
stand, right in front of the
Yeah.
78.
Yes. Well, I'm sitting.
Fair enough. It's hard to
Yes.
tell because of the zoom, the camera angle.
Yes. Well, I'm much taller when I'm standing up, but not very much actually.
How do you manage that? You must be very short-legged.
Yes, I am. Well, but not short-winded.
Fair enough.
Anyway, uh, yeah. Well, there's a lot of things here, so I'm just kind of going through my filing index in my head. But I did also want to ask you about other things that you've done as an actor because when I was doing research for this, most of the interviews I saw were about Alsatias and about the Marx Brothers, which is great, but I don't know that much about your acting career outside of that.
Well, I'd be happy to talk about that. It is true that certainly over the last 10 years, a little bit more than that now, most of what I've done that has gotten any kind of public recognition has involved the Marx Brothers. So that is mostly what you'll find. I also, although performing on stage is, of all the things that I've done, the thing I enjoy the most. I mean, there's nothing more enjoyable than performing comedy in front of an audience. It is, in some ways, it's the thing I've done the least, especially lately, in recent years. And it's also the thing that I have sort of consciously decided not to make a career of. If you'll forgive the phrase, you know, for example, I've never really pursued acting work or, the career or the life of an actor. Even though I love doing it, temperamentally, I'm much more a writer. And it seemed to me early on in my early years in New York, like if I were going to pursue the life of a performer, I would really have to pursue it to the exclusion of everything else. And the other thing about that is taking jobs that don't necessarily move you because you need to make a living. Um, Appeals to me more in some other areas than it does in performance. I mean, I love to perform what I want to perform,
Right.
but it never really seemed that appealing to me to be like a working commercial actor.
Well,
Um,
it's funny. I just assumed that you were.
well, I mean, I have done some professional acting, and I've enjoyed something close to 100% of my acting experiences. But at some point, I decided the making a living stuff, I'm going to put more in my design and writing work. That stuff, particularly design, is a little easier for me to do um, for hire, or on command. And I decided the performance stuff, I will just create performance opportunities for myself and do it that way. Write and produce plays and give myself a little role in them. So pretty much all the acting I've done has been either in my own work or sometimes people ask me to do something
Right.
because they know me from my own work. And I'm always so happy when that happens. Anytime someone invites me to do a little acting in something, those are always some of the best experiences I have. But other than like high school theater, I don't have a long list of, and then I did the pajama game. I mean, I did a little bit of that community theater life
Mm.
during the Florida years.
Yeah.
But my often collaborator and wife and best friend, Amanda Sisk, who's often my producing partner and our creative other half. She and I produced a series of political satires
Hmm.
during the George W. Bush years. These were called the Nero Fiddled musicals. It was 4 shows in 5 years, I think. That was during those years the main thrust of my work in the theater. Those were actually a lot of Tom Lehrer influence there,
I would think so.
yeah. Satirical reviews about politics. They were kind of sketch comedy shows that had narrative through lines. And I wrote those, wrote songs for them, and we wrote and directed them together. And I also would play multiple roles in them.
Yeah.
And I played Donald Rumsfeld, political figures of that era, Rudy Giuliani in one of them, and I would usually be the narrator too.
Yeah. Um, well, I was thinking about something, and can we go back to the Marx Brothers for a second?
Yeah,
Because
of course.
yeah, I have a Frank Ferrante story that I wanted to tell you because I mentioned him a few minutes ago. That I've seen him twice, and the second time I saw him was it was a bad week for me because, and I'm sorry I'm jumping subjects so abruptly here, but no, but I was having a bad week because my cousin died, and then
Oh,
a few days after that I lost a friend who was Well, my cousin was 98, so it wasn't surprising. But he was a good guy, and it was a shame. And then the friend that I lost was only 36, and she had a heart attack and died suddenly. So
Oh my goodness.
yeah, that was tough. So Cindy and Leonard, if you're out there, I'm thinking of you. And fortunately, I had Frank to distract me from that. So
Mm.
and his show was really fun. And I just remember talking to him in the lobby, and he was sitting on a bench in the lobby, and I remember just sitting down next to him and telling him how I had been having such a tragic week and how his show helped to cheer me up from all of that. And he was very gracious about that, and I've never forgotten that. So I imagine because you're on the show, he's probably watching this. So Frank, if you're watching, thank you so much for your kindness.
Oh, that's terrific. Yeah. And it is true. I mean, that's part of the value of entertainment, you know. It's like it's always welcome, but then there are times when it's more than welcome. You actually need it in order to get to the next day.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but just getting back to happier subjects, I guess we can continue with talking about the Nero Fiddle plays and things like that. I was going to ask you, and I try not to get too political on this show, but I guess anybody who reads your Facebook feed knows that you're very passionate about politics, and I just wondered where that came from, how that started in your life.
I've always been interested in politics. I guess that comes partly from family. I mean, I think my family tends to be, interested in politics, politically informed, and knowing what was going on in the news was definitely a value in my household growing up. I just sort of took an interest in it. I noticed elections, like I mean, I guess the first presidential election that I was really aware of was the Reagan versus Mondale election, which would have been 84. Um, yeah, 84. So I was about 7 years old. So that's pretty young to be like thinking about presidential election. But I was, and I was aware that Geraldine Ferraro was the first female vice presidential candidate. That was a big deal, to my mother and in our house. Um, and then I also always appreciated the intersection of politics with the other thing that I was really interested in, which was show business, a
Yeah,
particular affinity for political satire and political drama, movies and plays about politics.
right.
Um,
I remember we
yeah.
had a conversation about Mort Saul at one point.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I also think to some extent, maybe another answer to this question is to some extent, I spent a lot of my uh, early adult years as an artist in search of subject matter. I felt very passionate about wanting to be creative and, do theater and write books and all that kind of stuff. But it took me some time to figure out what it was that I wanted to write about. Um, I partly because of the influence of Woody Allen and other artists, I spent my teenage years and the first part of my adulthood thinking that I was primarily going to be an autobiographical type artist,
Hmm.
and that I was going to write things that were kind of based on my life and based on the people I knew, and that were going to be about my own search for love and my own life among my friends.
You mean I'll Say She Is isn't based on your life?
Actually, there in some ways it is, but not in that way. I that's kind of where I thought I was going, being a sort of Dear Diary artist. And then I realized in my 20s that for whatever reason, I wasn't really doing great work in that mode. The stuff I was writing was kind of precious and self-indulgent,
Hmm.
and it felt very formulaic. It felt very derivative of, among other things, Woody Allen and the stuff I was inspired by. And I just realized, oh, wow, this isn't really working, writing like a musical based on my teenage love life, wasn't good. Um, so I mean, writing about myself in that way seemed not to be working out the way I hoped it would. So it was like, well, then what is it? What am I going to write about? You start looking for like, maybe I'm an adapter of existing properties, or maybe I'm need to collaborate with people who have more to say. And then I just kind of realized in my 20s, as those years progressed, like, oh no, actually, politics is the answer or is an answer. And for a while, it was my main answer to that question. I'm going to write about politics. It's something I know about, I feel strongly about, I have something to say. And although I wouldn't expect someone who virulently disagreed with me about politics to be persuaded because they saw, you know, like a musical I wrote. I do think that agitprop can be really valuable in galvanizing the people who already agree, but they're not necessarily doing anything about it. And I thought that art could inspire activism, and that was a good enough reason to do it. And I do still believe in that, and I think politics is a good answer to that question. I have mostly um, moved away from politics as the subject for art for other reasons, which I'd be happy to talk about if you want to hear about them. Um, but no disenchantment with the idea of doing it. That was a good answer to the question, what do you write about? And since then, I have figured out other answers to that question that have served me well. I have found like, oh, I actually do have this to say and this to say and this to say, but they tended to be things that I learned after that period. I think part of the confusion of that early adulthood and teenage period was nothing had happened to me yet. I mean, it's like, what am I going to talk about? Well, I can talk about dating and high school because that's all I know. I had to like get through some life to realize, oh no, I have stuff to talk about.
Yeah, well, that's all very interesting. Thank you for sharing all that. And I want to jump topics again. And you mentioned collaborating with Amanda. And if you don't mind, I was just wanted to ask how you met.
We met through a mutual friend in 1998. Um, it was my second year in New York, and she had just moved to New York. And we were friends first. We were friends for years before we, got together as a couple
Yeah, and that's all you want
or
to say?
as collaborators. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then how did you start collaborating?
We started collaborating in a very informal way, just as in the course of our friendship, we would often play this game where we would just pass a notebook back and forth. She would just write a few random sentences and pass the notebook to me, and I would continue it. We collaborated in that way, not for any public consumption, but just to amuse ourselves. And then as we got to know each other better and spent more time together, we did other versions of the passing the notebook thing. We would record ourselves a lot. We're both kind of uh, uh, so-so musicians, with instruments, but we would always have musical instruments and play as well as we could and make up songs and record ourselves. We had a four-track recorder at one point. This is before it was really easy to do multi-track recordings on the computer as it is now, or on your phone. We had this four-track that would record on both sides of an audio cassette, so you could multi-track yourselves, and we would make, crazy, surreal, like John and Yoko style, four-track creations. And we would do visual art that way, draw pictures where one of us would, draw something. The other person would take the notebook and decide the thing that the other person drew wasn't really what it seemed to be, make it into something else. So we were collaborating in that way for a long time before we started to like, produce theater together.
Yeah. So then, I guess continuing with that, then how did producing theater together start?
I guess it was just the thing that we both were interested in doing, and we might as well do this together too. We were doing so many things together and having such a good time doing it. And this is kind of not just in my marriage and my relationship with Amanda, but most of my friendships too were formed this way by working on things together. I think one of the things you sort of buy into if you have this kind of artist's lifestyle where you know, you're not making a living doing the one thing you care about the most. Your life is a whole series of creative projects, and some of them are because you have to do them for money, and some of them are because you love to do them. Maybe once in a while you get lucky and something is both. But it doesn't leave a lot of room for other stuff, you know, so you don't tend to have a lot of hobbies or recreational
Yeah,
activities. You tend not to be a big traveler unless you have to for a project. So, you know, it's also the way I've, you know, met and gotten to know most of the friends in my life. And most of the good times I've spent with the people I love have been spent, you know, working on creative projects and problems.
yeah. I guess the only thing I have that's comparable to that is that I've been teaching for 16 years, and a lot of my students have become friends. So there is that.
Yeah. Hey, listen, teaching is art. I mean, teaching, or I'll say it, teaching can be art. You know, I mean, a teacher is putting on a one-person show every day, you know, or
Yeah.
every day that he or she teaches. Um,
When
and a lot of the stuff that I've done that I think of as art, you could just as easily think of as teaching. You know, I was a New York City tour guide for many years.
yes.
Um, that's teaching. And I my New York City tour then became a solo show, a theatrical monologue about the history of New York. And you know, if you do that in a theater, it's art. If you do it in a classroom, it's teaching.
Yeah. Well, and it does require rehearsal when I teach, so there is that. And I'm trying to get laughs and sometimes failing, so there's that too.
You know, I mean, when you're a little kid, especially, and you first have the experience of being in school, you know, it's like watching a show. This teacher, you know, this is who I'm
Yeah.
watching, huh? You know,
Right. I
it better be
remember.
good.
Oh, go ahead. I
No,
was gonna
that's it.
I was gonna say I remember watching the Steve Martin documentary that came out recently, and he said at one point when comedy wasn't working out, he was going to be a teacher because that's performing.
Absolutely right. Yeah. My father taught high school English
Oh,
for 30 years, I
so,
think.
so did
And
mine.
oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's something. So we're both the sons of teachers. That's
You
interesting.
son of a teacher.
How dare you, sir?
Yeah.
How dare you? Yeah, I mean, it is very, they are very closely related, teaching and uh, writing and performance.
Yeah. Anyway, I could probably go off on a whole tangent about my teaching career, and I'm happy to talk to you about that some other time. But
Yeah.
you're the guest here, so I guess there's a couple other things we have in common that I wanted to cover, and one of them is writing, which you've touched on. And were you just kind of always writing all your life, like me, ever since you were a child?
Yeah. Yeah, I was always writing and drawing. Um, yeah, it was always, that was just what I wanted to do, you know? I mean, it's not necessarily all I did, but it was my main thing. You know, the same way some kids by default, what they want to do is run around, you know? Like what I wanted to do was have a pen or a pencil or a crayon or something in my hand and some paper and to be making something, you know, writing something or drawing something or both. It was real, you know, to invoke Sondheim. It was the look I made a hat urge, you know, I just wanted to make stuff.
Right. Yeah, I had a thought there and I lost it. Uh,
Well, it was about like childhood affinities for.
oh yeah, I was just gonna say that I can't draw, but I used to draw anyway. I used to do little comic strips and things just because I could, because nobody told me, hey, you can't draw. This looks like crap. So I just kept doing it.
Well, I really think it's important, you know, to do stuff whether you're good at it or not. For one thing, everyone who's ever been good at something started off being bad at it. You know, I mean, that's how you get good. But then again, it's not even that getting good has to be the point, you know. It's important and healthy and human and therapeutic, and it's very useful to create something, you know, play music, sing something, write something, draw something, or just, you know, arrange items on a shelf in your home in a way that's
Yes.
aesthetically pleasing. That's uses muscles that do you good.
Yes. So, how do you think your writing progressed over time? Because, I look at things I wrote when I was 12 that were terrible, and then I can look at things I wrote in college that were pretty good, and I look at things I'm writing now, and there is obviously a progression. So, uh, what's that been like with your work?
Oh, it's a good question. It's an interesting question. I think um, I think I've gotten better at it. I think I'm more aware now of what my liabilities are, which is an important part of getting good. I know what I need to avoid. Um, I know when I look back on a rough draft of something, I know what that's going to be like. I know, for example, I have a tendency to overwrite.
Yeah.
I have a tendency to reiterate things too many times, beat a point to death. So, I sort of allow myself to do that when I write, and then when I go back to polish, I know that I'm going to cut half of that. So that's one answer to your question. I've gotten more confident about the craft of writing. I also have gotten a little stingier in a way with writing. Back when I thought I was a Dear Diary artist, and I thought that my work was going to be autobiographical and that I was going to sort of make myself the main character in a half fictitious universe. I felt like writing was about inspiration. And so I was a writer who carried a notebook everywhere. I was always writing. I would like ride the subway around New York and just furiously fill notebook pages, with
Yeah.
whatever thoughts were on my mind. Like, couldn't possibly move my hand across the page fast enough to get down all that I'm thinking and feeling. Um, and that's good. I mean, that's a great thing to do. But I found that most of what I generated that way wasn't really usable. Might have done me some good in other ways, but I didn't really wind up with material that I could show to anybody or that added up to anything that I could imagine being a book or a play or a song. Most of it was, unsurprisingly, very self-indulgent. I mean, by definition, it was self-indulgent. And I'm not saying that there aren't many writers, and I know some, who, with that same approach, can write profound, universal, beautiful stuff. Um, but what it did for me was it sent me farther inward, and I don't need to go any further inward. If anything, I need more engagement with the rest of the world. And so then when I went through this change, I really became a writer who writes when he has something to say. And it's almost unheard of now that I will like write just for the sake of writing. Um, I write when I've got something to write, a project that I'm working on,
Yes.
or even more practical, writing letters to people and stuff like that. Um, I'm not sure what all of this means, but that is a change in my life as a writer. Like I have a shelf of notebooks, like through maybe my early 30s, where I was just filling a notebook all the time. And then it abruptly stops when I get busier as a productive artist.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm just kind of taking this all in, but again, it's all interesting, and this is why I wanted to have you on to get more insight into the way your mind works. So I thank you again.
Uh,
And
well, I hope that hasn't been too disturbing.
well, you should see my mind sometime after 9 o'clock, but I don't think you want to go there.
What happens at 9 o'clock?
Well, usually I'm getting ready for bed around that time.
I see. I see. It's the dimming of the dimming of the day.
Yes. Well, there's another subject that I wanted to touch on, and something that's very important to me, and that's radio. I know you've done some voiceover work and things like that, so tell me something about that.
Yeah, well, one of the great things about this age that we are living in is, it's easy to just try stuff. And produce some audio content if that's what you want to do. Yeah, I've always liked audio only. Partly it's because not having to worry about visuals is very freeing. And I love visuals too. I have made my living mostly as a visual artist and designer, and I always get very involved in the visual part of whatever I'm doing. I've joked before that like I'm the kind of playwright who starts writing a play and takes a break to design the poster, like in the middle of writing scene one, you get a good idea for the poster. So I love that side of things. But working on something that is just radio or a podcast, for that very reason, it means I can't lean on those muscles quite as much. As is often the case in art, limitations wind up being not limiting, but expanding. You know,
Yeah,
if you have just a blank sheet of paper and you can do whatever you want, it's kind of overwhelming. You don't know where to start. You don't know what you're doing or what it is. But if somebody says it's got to be about a bear, in a purple car, your first thought is going to be, I don't care about a bear in a purple car. But okay, if it has to be about that, and next thing you know, it's led you somewhere. So
right.
um, anyway, you get the point. I needn't beat this horse anymore. But I think that's part of why audio only stuff is fun because it's challenging.
Yeah. I mean, I've basically been doing radio comedy for about 30 years, so there's a lot of things I could tell you there.
You don't have to dress up, you don't have to memorize things. You can produce it in a sort of more comfortable way. It's easier to pull off an illusion when nobody's looking at you.
Yes. Well, can I tell you about some of my radio shows? I don't know if
Yeah,
you've
please.
did you ever hear any of them or
I don't think so.
I've posted them on my Facebook page, but nobody pays attention over there, so I don't know.
I
But
miss things sometimes too. I just think my feed doesn't algorithmically keep me in touch with everybody. I have listened to this show though. I've listened to some
oh,
of
you
your
have.
interviews and enjoyed them a lot. Yeah.
Oh, you didn't tell me that. I didn't know.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I should have reported back to you. Yeah, I listened to your interview with Shannon Quinty, which I thought
Yes.
was terrific, and
Oh,
Michael
thank you.
Camella, who's I don't know him well, but I'm aware of him, and a very interesting guy. And also
Jordan Young.
Jordan Young. Yeah, that was also really interesting. That guy has a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Well,
So anyway, no, I've been following this show and like it a lot.
thank you. I really appreciate that. But yeah, again, I feel like I should apologize for going into talking about myself, but I guess that's the purpose of a conversation to exchange stories. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I started when I was 8 years old. My parents bought a karaoke machine, and we didn't really use it for karaoke. We just used it as a tape deck and played tapes on it. So around that time, my dad had these records of he had sound effects records, which is kind of strange. I don't know why he had them, but somehow I got into the idea because we had this tape recorder and we had these records. Why don't we just take some of these sound effects off of these records and create stories with them? So that's kind of how I started, just making these cassette tapes. Remember cassette tapes, kids? Uh, we made these tapes when I was a little kid, and that kind of evolved into doing because I'm an only child. So my dad was kind of who I would play with, and we just started making up these half-hour shows, and we created recurring characters and did this whole thing that turned into a half-hour show that we would do almost every night. And so I have all these crates full of all these tapes that we did, which fortunately I can still play. But yeah, that became a regular thing, and that was real. We did them for 14 years, all the way through college. So
Wow, that's a
yeah,
long run.
yeah, and we had no listeners, so I don't know how we lasted that long. No ratings. I mean, some people,
Well, I guess it wasn't listener supported.
yeah, well, some people have low ratings. We had no ratings. Uh, but yeah, that was basically how I learned to create characters and how I learned voice acting and how to improvise with somebody else, and it all came from there. And then after college, I was kind of getting too old to, kind of play around, play pretend with my father anymore. So we kind of stopped that. But then I was looking for something else to do, and so I started this thing because I was teaching and I liked just hanging out with people and watching movies, and my students became my friends. So I knew that one of my students was an actress, so I kind of brought her in to do an improv thing with her and my cousin Joe, who also is not an actor, but he's just naturally a funny guy and does impressions and good character voices and that kind of thing. So me and Joe and my student, whose name was Phyllis, the three of us just started doing radio improv together, and we had a regular improv group, and we posted things online every week. And that was a real challenge because we just had to keep coming up with fresh ideas every week, and we did about 200 shows in 4 years, and so that was fun. I just remember sitting around our living room table making each other laugh, and those were good times. And unfortunately, Phyllis is another one who's gone now, but she was great. And then from there, I went to, that was not very successful. Nobody was really listening to those shows. So I thought instead of doing improv, I'd better go the other way and try to do something that's scripted. So I did this series of just short radio pieces, which was called Speed Laughs, which I have on my YouTube channel. And that's a whole long story in itself, and I'm rambling here. But we did 4 seasons of Speed Laughs, and that was basically about a woman detective solving crimes. And it was just a weird. I don't know. Are you familiar with the Goon Show?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love the Goon Show. They were a huge influence on me. So it was just that same kind of just really, really off the wall humor, and I would just let my imagination run wild and do these weird stories with Speed Laughs. So we have 4 seasons of that that's out there on YouTube if anybody wants to hear that. Um, so that's approximately the history of my work as a radio actor from 1995 until now. So there you
Wow.
go.
Oh, good for you. Well, yeah, I'll have to catch up with some of this stuff. Sounds great.
Yeah. I've gotten some negative feedback on some of it, but if you want to listen to it, I'm happy to have you listen to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I guess how long have we been on? Yeah, it's been about an hour. So I guess there's one important thing we should address, and that's your current project. So here's your forum to do a plug here.
Well, yeah, I've been working on this thing for a while now, although it's taken many forms. Um, it's called Pintele, and this is a Jewish identity project that has been on my plate on and off for a few years. It will be out as a podcast, a limited series audio experience. But it's gone through many phases. I started around the beginning of 2022. Um, I had all this stuff going on in my head about being Jewish, which I am, and which has been a sort of lifelong um, subject of mixed emotions for me. Um, I've had a lot of confusion about what it means to be Jewish, particularly since I'm not religious and I'm not a believer in that sense. Um, but I've always been quick to say, well, but being Jewish is very important to me, even though I'm not religious, you know. But what do I mean by that, you know? And I realized, well, this is a subject I have a lot to say about. And around 2022, when I started working on this, um, there seemed to be a lot going on that seemed to be sort of urging me toward this subject matter to do something about Jewish identity, which was partly the social justice protests that emerged after the murder of George Floyd and the conversation that was taking place about race in America, which is obviously so important. But I felt and continue to feel and have always felt that, you know, there's sort of a race missing from that conversation, and that in the American conversation about race and ethnicity, people never quite know what to do with Jewish people, and where to classify us, how to deal with the fact that is this a religion? Is it a race? Is it a nationality? Is it an ethnicity? What are we talking about here? And I noticed as I came to realize some other thinkers have, David Baddiel, a British comedian, is chief among them, that there was something about the way we on the progressive left talk about race and ethnic identity that deliberately or not, excludes Jewish people. And I felt, oh, I think I might have a lot to say about this. And I just started to write. Um, I was sort of between Marx Brothers projects in that moment, so I had the freedom to like figure out what I wanted to work on next. And I thought, well, maybe this is it. And I kind of thought maybe it would be like my show, 400 Years in Manhattan, a theatrical monologue. But as I kept writing, I realized I had way too much material, like way more to say than I could possibly get into a 90-minute or even 2 hour evening at the theater. This was an example where I actually did go back to the old thing and I was feeling so inspired. I was filling up notebooks, you know, and I wrote, many tens of thousands of words fairly quickly during the first few months of 2022. And it sort of fell into what started to feel like a set of essays. Well, here's a piece about like how I feel about religion and God and that aspect of the Jewish experience. And here's one about my Jewish heroes in show business, and here's a piece about when I was a little kid, how confused I was about, whether you could be Jewish and American at the same time, and here's a piece about my brief and not very happy experience in Hebrew school, and here's a piece that recreates a Passover Seder at my aunt and uncle's house from when I was a little kid, all these different angles on the Jewish experience, but really on my Jewish experience. And it just started to feel like this. I don't know what this can be. It's too long to be a theater piece, but too much of it is performance oriented for it to be a book. Um, and so I kind of left it alone for a while because I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with it. Then I got busy with Marx Brothers projects on the calendar. That was 2022, so I was working on at the in the fall of that year. I did the third of the video presentations that I did for Fredonia Marxonia,
Yes.
which was called "If You Get Near a Song, Play It," the Marx Brothers in music. So that sort of took over the second half mostly of 2022. And in 2023, there was another big project that I had promised to work on. Then 2024, we did a big Marx Fest in New York City. So that was a big Marx Brothers year. And all these Marx Brothers projects needed my attention. And then by the time it was possible to go back to the Jewish Identity Project, which I think by that time I had decided to call Pintele, and I'll explain the title in a moment. Um, by the time I was able to spend time on it again, because I sort of had cleared all the Marx Brothers stuff off my calendar, um, the subject matter felt a little harder to deal with than before because October 7th had happened. The Israel-Hamas war was raging in Gaza. Those were really difficult things to talk about. I already was not sure how to handle the subject of Israel, which, even before October 7th and the Gaza war, I had confused and mixed feelings about. And I thought, well, I don't know if I want to go near this topic anymore because it's going to mean I have to confront this thing I don't really feel ready to talk about. And then, as 2024 ground on, all these things started to happen that made me feel like, okay, it is the right time to deal with this. And I'm going to have to figure out how I feel about Israel and Gaza. And I'm going to have to, say that because there are all these other things telling me that it is time to deal with this subject, maybe kind of urgently. I'll respect your desire, Andrew, not to let this show get too political, but I'll say that my response to, as I saw it, the catastrophic results of the 2024 election meant that we are living not as I had hoped in an era wherein America narrowly avoided a descent into theocratic fascism, but in fact, this is the descent. And the environment politically in the United States, but also in the world, is so uncomfortably reminiscent of the gathering storms in the first part of the 20th century in Europe. Um, okay, now I feel not only like the Jewish Identity Project is worth spending time on, but like maybe it's even a responsibility to spend time on it. And so, and thanks for bearing with me through this absurdly long-winded answer to your question.
I have
So
a
I,
choice.
not at all, stay there, sit and listen. So I decided I'm going to do this. I'm going to move forward with it. I'll do it just by myself, so nobody else is demanding that I finish it on any particular schedule. It's just my own urgency to get it out, and the decision to make it a limited series 7-part podcast is correct, so it is a performance piece. I am performing it. I do characters, and there's definitely a dramatic and comedic element to it. But it also kind of is like a very produced audiobook, chapters of a book organized into subcategories and with a lot of music and a lot of performance to it. Um, and since I told you I'd explain the title, there's this Yiddish expression, das Pintele Yid, which I encountered um, while researching all of this. And it literally means the little Jewish spark. And it's an idea in Yiddish literature that refers to this idea that, like all Jewish people, even if you're not religious and even if you're not particularly involved with cultural Jewishness, even if you don't know that you're Jewish, um, according to this kind of mystical concept, you still have inside you this Pintele Yid, this little Jewish spark that sort of can be activated under the right circumstances, and that you always have with you, and that can be relied on and it's a reminder that there are some things about being Jewish that are not a matter of choice, and that are always with you, and that you don't have to, that don't require any effort to maintain. And so it seemed like a really good title for this piece, which is partly about like, what does it mean to be Jewish, and what does it mean to be Jewish under all these circumstances? Not religious, don't really believe in God, have ambivalent feelings about the Jewish homeland. And so that's what this is. It's 7 episodes. Each one is roughly an hour long, some a little over, some a little under. And I've been hard at work on it. It's my main thing these days. There's the day job, and then there's Pintele. And I think I'm on track to the schedule I announced is that I hope to release the first episode by the end of April, and then release them weekly after that until I get through the 7. But we'll see.
Well, of course, my problem is I'm only half Jewish, so I have to stop listening when I'm on the halfway through the fourth episode.
You can go in up to your knees.
Yes.
Well, I should say I hope that it's interesting to Jewish people, non-Jewish people, religious people, non-religious people. I'm trying really hard to make it accessible and universal and entertaining and funny. There's a lot of stuff in it that's difficult and challenging and emotional, either because it's about some of the painful history of the Jewish people and of my family. I mean, um, there's no such thing as a Jewish person who doesn't have horrible tragedies in their family background because of what Jewish people have been through on the world stage. Um, so that, in addition to, the challenges of talking about religion in a way that will not hurt anybody's feelings or offend anybody. And then, as I mentioned, the challenges of talking about contemporary politics, whether in the United States or in the Middle East. So it's fraught, it's challenging. It would be easier to just not talk about this stuff, but that's kind of an invitation to talk about them. And if I've done a good job, it's also fun and half Jewish, 75% Jewish, 0% Jewish. I think hopefully enjoyable and maybe even thought-provoking.
Yeah. Well, good luck with it. Mazel tov.
Thank you very much.
And on that note, I guess we can wrap it up. So thank you. I'm always kind of nervous before a show, and I was nervous about this one, but you've been great. This was so much fun.
Thank you, Andrew. I've had a great time talking to you too. And as I said at the start, it's surprising to me that this is the first time we've talked, but I look forward to next time.
Yes, I hope there will be a next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.